Recently, Catholic apologist Trent Horn did a video addressing James Tallarico, who's running for the United States Senate in the state of Texas. And James Tallarico made some claims about a couple different things, but we're going to be focusing specifically on abortion. Trent Horn did a response video to it. I'm Steve Perry. This is Biblical Anarchy, and Trent Horn is the author of the book When Protestants Argue Like Atheists. But in this video, Trent Horn is guilty of being a Catholic who's arguing like a Protestant. Now, he does make a good Catholic argument against abortion, and we're going to start out with that. But then we're going to get into the bad arguments he tries to make from the Bible and show where they are problematic.
The religious right has made a concerted effort to make homosexuality and abortion the two biggest issues for Christians. And the Southern Baptist Convention was pro-choice until the late 1970s. So this idea that to be a Christian means you have to be anti-gay and anti-abortion, there really is no historical, theological, biblical basis for that opinion.
Now, I do point out in my previous episode when Protestants were pro-choice that many mainline denominations, and even the Southern Baptists, were pro-choice in the 1960s and 70s to varying degrees. But the Catholic Church has always opposed abortion. According to the Catechism, since the first century, the Church has affirmed the moral evil of every procured abortion. This teaching has not changed and remains unchangeable. Direct abortion, that is to say, abortion willed either as an end or a means, is gravely contrary to the moral law.
Now, there's no real problem with what Trent Horn said there. There's some nuance that gets ignored there. The difference between life begins at conception and life begins at the quickening. But he's right. I mean, the Didache is a late 1st, early 2nd century writing, the teaching of the 12, and it tells you flat out, you can't get an abortion. It has been the teaching of the church from the beginning, which raises a question, then why do the Protestants not agree, or why did the Protestants not agree with this teaching that had been around in the church since the 1st century? And that gets to the point of why the church splits. But notice, Trent Horn just flies right over this. Watch.
The religious right has made a concerted effort to make homosexuality and abortion the two biggest issues for Christians. And, the Southern Baptist Convention was pro-choice until the late 1970s. So this idea that to be a Christian means you have to be anti-gay and anti-abortion, there really is no historical, theological, biblical basis for that opinion.
Now, I do point out in my previous episode when Protestants were pro-choice that many mainline denominations, and even the Southern Baptists, were pro-choice in the 1960s and 70s to varying degrees.
The problem here is that James Tallarico has overstated his case. He said there's no biblical, historical, or theological reason why a Christian would have to be pro-life. Trent Horn's about to address the historical and theological reasons why a Christian would have to be pro-life. But there's no biblical reason, and that's why the Protestants were not following the Catholic footsteps on the position of abortion. In order for the Protestants, who rejected the Catholic idea that infallible teachings could be gained from the oral teachings of the apostles, which were later written down, Protestants rejected that idea, and they said, no, only the Bible has infallible teaching authority. So in order to have a position against abortion, they needed to get it from the Bible, and it just isn't there. Now, Trent Horn is going to argue like a Protestant. He's going to read the Bible like a Protestant later in this video and try to get it into the Bible by reading it in creative ways, but it's just not there. Now, here's Trent Horn's response as far as the theological and historical aspect of the church being opposed to abortion and therefore it being necessary for Christians to be opposed to abortion.
But the Catholic Church has always opposed abortion. According to the Catechism, since the 1st century, the Church has affirmed the moral evil of every procured abortion. This teaching has not changed and remains unchangeable. Direct abortion, that is to say, abortion willed either as an end or a means, is gravely contrary to the moral law.
Here, Trent Horn is making the strongest argument that a Christian can make, that Christians should be opposed to abortion. For the first 1,500 years of church history, this was the teaching of the church. It wasn't until the Protestant Reformation and the idea of sola scriptura, that only the Bible has infallible teaching authority. That's the point where we began to demand that a teaching of the church be found in the Bible. And without that demand, the church operated fine for 1,500 years. And while there was some dispute over when it became an abortion, they were opposed to abortion the entire time, just like Trent Horn says. He's right here. But this also is a very important point, because this shows where the Protestant argument against abortion goes completely off the rails. The argument that you will generally hear from Protestants is that life begins at conception. And this is a bit of a deceptive argument. Now, Catholics say the same thing, but they mean something different by it. To argue that life begins at conception is a completely arbitrary choice of when life begins, because the fact of the matter is, life doesn't begin. When a woman gets pregnant, you have a cell from the sperm and a cell from the egg that come together, they fuse together to make a new cell. Both the sperm and the egg are alive. The new cell is alive. It then goes through the processes of gestation. It becomes a zygote. It becomes an embryo. It becomes a fetus. And eventually it's born as a baby. You could look at biological markers such as when the heartbeat begins or when brain activity begins. You could look at all these points and pick whichever one you like. That's when life begins, you could argue, because it was always living. The sperm was living, the egg was living. So when Protestants pick conception, that's when life begins. Then I ask you this. So when the sperm is introduced into the woman and there are multiple eggs and multiple sperm, how do you determine which sperm is sacred and which egg is sacred before they come together? And that's where Catholics don't have that problem. They're opposed to the use of contraception, either condoms or birth control pills. They're opposed to any sex where you are blocking the woman from getting pregnant. Now, it could be a woman who can't get pregnant. That's okay. Sarah couldn't get pregnant, and yet she did, right? So it's not that it's wrong to have sex in a situation where you think the woman won't get pregnant. It's that it's wrong to intentionally block the procreative act of sex and engage in the activity. So masturbation, for example, would also be wrong, because the sperm and the egg are treated as sacred from the beginning. So the Catholics don't have to pick a point and say, okay, now suddenly this particular sperm and this particular egg are sacred. No, they say the whole thing is sacred all along. So their point is consistent. It is a theological point. But when I say, like James Tallarico says, that life begins at first breath, we are actually taking something from the Bible, and Trent Horn will say we're using it the wrong way. He's wrong. I'm going to show that later. But we are actually taking a teaching from the Bible, which Protestants claim to be sola scriptura. When does life begin? Well, it begins at first breath. And this is something that's taught repeatedly through the Bible. And that's the teaching that we're taking and we're going with, saying that's when life begins. Now, I doubt that either, I know for myself, but James Tallarico possibly doesn't hold this view simply because the Bible says it as well. It's that this is an arbitrary choice. You can pick any point when the heartbeat begins. Okay. How do I argue against that? Well, it's clearly alive because it was alive all along at conception. How do I argue against that? Now, some Protestants will say, but you have a new organism growing inside the mother that has DNA different than the mother. Okay. The sperm is an organism inside the mother that has DNA different from the mother, and she can get pregnant up to 5 days later. So then I would ask the same Protestant, if you know the woman has not yet gotten pregnant and you had some way to inject a spermicide into the woman to kill the sperm, would it be murder? Right? Because she hasn't gotten pregnant yet. They would have to say no, because she hasn't conceived yet. But a Catholic would say, that's a sin. That's wrong. You can't do it. They're consistent in their view. Protestants are not. They've picked an arbitrary point in the process and decided to force all women, when you make it a law, to force all women to live by their arbitrary decision. If they accepted the Catholic teaching on this, the Catholic theology, which granted isn't biblical. I agree, but it's been the teaching of the church from day one. And if they accepted this teaching, they would then have a consistent argument against abortion. But when Protestants run into people like myself who don't agree with them and who understand that any point we pick is arbitrary and therefore it should be left up to the individual to decide. So when you're making a law, the law should say that life begins at first breath, because at that point, everything that we consider necessary for you to be alive is there. You are ruled to no longer be alive when you are no longer breathing and you no longer have brain activity and you no longer have a heartbeat. So until all of those things are there, we shouldn't rule you to be alive legally, when what we're actually doing is making an arbitrary decision and forcing it on others. Now, I'm going to do some more videos after this talking about where Trent Horn gets the Bible, things in the Bible, scholarship about the Bible wrong. Because in this video, I don't usually do this with Trent Horn because he's very good. But in this video, he is arguing like a Protestant. And he gets all these things wrong because he's having to turn to the Bible and say, hey, the Bible is against abortion. We're going to start with the very next video is going to just be an overview on his simplistic case from the Bible that the Bible is against abortion, and we're going to prove that wrong. And then we're going to move on to specific passages like Numbers 5 and the jealousy law. But if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it on social media, subscribe to the channel so you'll be notified when the new videos on this topic come up. I plan to start doing a lot more videos in the future, and what I want to focus on is specifically things in the Torah that I find interesting and fascinating. But when things like this come up that I feel the need to address, I'm going to go ahead and address them. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Thank you.